Welcome back. I am Gilbert Doctorow. I am an independent international affairs analyst based in Brussels. I am a graduate of Harvard College and hold a PhD in history from Columbia University. I have spent the last 50 years studying American foreign policy, Russian affairs, and global geopolitics at close range, not from a think tank funded by the Pentagon, not from a university chair paid for by defense contractors, but independently, with no agenda except the truth. And today I want to talk about something that should make every thinking American deeply uncomfortable. I want to talk about a war that Washington said was over. And I want to talk about what happened just 72 hours later. Because what is unfolding right now in the Strait of Hormuz is not just a military story, it is a story about the collapse of credibility, about the distance between words and reality, and about the profound failure of American strategic thinking that I have been warning about for years. Let us begin. I want to give you two facts. Just two. Hold them both in your mind. Fact number one, May 5th, 2026, White House briefing room. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stands at the podium and says these exact words. The operation is over. We're done with that stage of it. Operation Epic Fury, the 2-month American-Israeli war against Iran, over. Done. Concluded. Washington moving on. Fact number two, May 8th, 2026, 72 hours later. Iranian missiles targeting 3 U.S. Navy destroyers in the Strait of Hormuz, American jets bombing Iranian military facilities on Qeshm Island, U.S. fighter planes disabling Iranian oil tankers, the UAE government sending emergency shelter alerts to its entire population, and Donald Trump calling Iranian missile strikes on his own Navy ships a love tap. One simple question. If the war was over on May 5th, what exactly is this on May 8th? I have been in this business for 50 years. I have watched American administrations lie to the public about Vietnam, about Iraq, about Libya, about Ukraine. But what I am watching right now in Washington is something that even I find extraordinary. Not because they are lying. Governments lie. That is not new. What is extraordinary is how quickly, how brazenly the lie collapsed. 72 hours. That is all it took. Let me give you the complete background, because you cannot understand what is happening today without understanding what happened in February, March, and April. February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, a massive coordinated military campaign against Iran. The targets were Iranian military facilities, nuclear sites, air defense systems, naval assets, and political leadership. Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei was killed. I want you to pause on that for a moment, because I wrote about this on my Substack the day it happened, and I said then what I will say again now. The assassination of a nation's supreme leader is not a surgical strike. It is not a precise military action with contained consequences. It is an act that guarantees a response, not because of emotion, not because of pride, but because of the fundamental logic of deterrence. If you allow your leader to be killed without a full response, you invite the next attack. Every nation on earth understands this. I wrote in February, I fully expect the Iranian regime to recover its poise. I expect them to inflict painful losses on Israel and the USA. That is exactly what has happened. Iran responded with missile barrages on Israeli cities. U.S. military bases in the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain were struck. Hezbollah in Lebanon launched rockets into Israel. The entire region was pulled into the conflict. March 4, 2026, Iran officially closed the Strait of Hormuz. Sea mines were laid, ships were warned away, any vessel attempting to transit was threatened with attack. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's seaborne oil passes, 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas. The economic lifeline of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Iraq all shut down. March 9, 2026, Donald Trump told the American public that Iran's military had been destroyed, and the Strait of Hormuz was open. I am going to be direct with you. That statement was false. Iran's military was damaged, significantly, but it was not destroyed, and the Strait of Hormuz was not open. It was effectively closed. Ships were not moving. Insurance companies had pulled coverage. Shipping firms had suspended operations entirely. Trump said it anyway, and the American media largely reported it without serious challenge. This is something I have written about extensively, the failure of the American press to hold power accountable. I saw it in the run-up to the Iraq War in 2003. I saw it during the Ukraine conflict, and I am seeing it again now. April 7-8, 2026. After weeks of escalating threats, Trump had written on social media that a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. Pakistan brokered a ceasefire. China gave Iran a final nudge. The shooting stopped, temporarily, April 13, 2026. Despite the ceasefire, the United States launched a counter-blockade of Iranian ports. No ships in, no ships out. The Guardian described what emerged as a dual blockade, America blockading Iran, Iran blockading the Gulf. I wrote about this dynamic on my Substack. I called it a strategic trap of Washington's own making, because you cannot simultaneously negotiate peace with a country and strangle its economy. You cannot ask Iran to open the strait while you are blockading their ports. The logic does not hold, but logic, I have observed, is not always Washington's strongest suit. May 4, 2026, Trump announced Operation Project Freedom. U.S. Navy ships would escort commercial vessels through Hormuz by force. Iran immediately called it a ceasefire violation. May 5, 2026, Rubio declared the war was over. May 6, 2026, Trump paused Project Freedom, citing great progress toward a deal with Iran. May 8, 2026, Hormuz fire. Again, that is the timeline. Now let us understand what it means. In my 50 years of watching American foreign policy, I have identified a very specific pattern. It appears again and again in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Ukraine, and now in Iran. The pattern works like this. First, a dramatic military action is taken. Bombs fall. Ships move. Press conferences are held. The action is presented as decisive, necessary, and above all, effective. Second, when the action produces results that are messier and more complicated than promised, the language changes. Victory is redefined. The goalposts move. What was once described as unconditional surrender becomes a memorandum of understanding for future negotiations. Third, when reality becomes impossible to hide, when missiles are flying and ships are burning, officials reach for language that minimizes and confuses. Love tap, ceasefire still holds. Defensive posture. And fourth, the press, with very few exceptions, follows along. They report the official language without the context that would expose the gap between that language and reality. I have watched Rubio go through all 4 stages in the space of 72 hours. On May 5th, the operation is over. On May 8th, Iranian missiles targeting U.S. destroyers, American bombs falling on Qeshm Island, and Rubio's response? Only stupid countries don't shoot back when you're shot at. No one asked him the obvious question. No reporter in that briefing room stood up and said, Secretary Rubio, you told us 3 days ago that the operation was over. You told us we had shifted to a defensive posture. You told us there would be no shooting unless we were shot at first. So who fired first in Hormuz on May 8th? That question was not asked. And that silence, that failure of the press, is as much a part of this story as anything that happened in the Strait. Now I want to go deeper into Rubio's May 5th statement, because there is something buried in it that the headlines missed entirely. Rubio said the operation was over. America had shifted to a defensive posture. The focus was now on restoring commercial shipping through Hormuz. Fine, let us accept that at face value for a moment. But then, in the same briefing, Rubio said something else. He said the nuclear issue has to be addressed and is being addressed in the negotiation. Let me translate that for you. The stated purpose of Operation Epic Fury, the reason Washington gave for launching a war that has killed thousands of people, closed the world's most important waterway, sent global gas prices to historic highs, and destabilized the entire Middle East, was Iran's nuclear program. That was the justification. Destroy Iran's path to a nuclear weapon. That was the mission. And on May 5th, Rubio told us, quietly, in the middle of a long briefing that the press largely summarized rather than analyzed, that the nuclear issue is still being addressed in the negotiation. Not resolved, not eliminated, not achieved. Being addressed. 2 months of war, thousands dead on both sides, the global economy shaken to its foundations, American families paying 52% more for gasoline than they were before February 28th, and the nuclear program is still being addressed in the negotiation. I want to be very precise here because precision matters in analysis. I am not saying the war was wrong to fight. That is a separate question and one I have addressed at length in my writing. I am saying something more specific. I am saying that the stated objective of the war has not been achieved. And that when Rubio stood at that podium on May 5th and said the operation is over, he was not announcing victory. He was announcing retreat dressed up in the language of completion. That is a very different thing. Let us talk about numbers, because numbers tell a story that words can obscure. The Strait of Hormuz is 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. It sits between Iran and Oman. And through this narrow channel, before February 28, 2026, flowed approximately 20% of the world's seaborne oil trade, roughly 20 million barrels per day. 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas also passed through here. This is not a regional waterway. This is a global artery. Saudi Arabia's oil exports through Hormuz, UAE's oil through Hormuz, Kuwait's oil through Hormuz, Iraqi oil through Hormuz. The energy that powers factories in Japan, South Korea, India, China, and much of Southeast Asia through Hormuz. Since March 4, 2026, effectively closed. Iran laid sea mines, attacked ships that attempted to transit, boarded commercial vessels, imposed tolls of over $1 million per ship on those it selectively allowed through. Shipping firms suspended operations. War risk insurance became either unavailable or prohibitively expensive. Then from April 13th, the United States added its own blockade of Iranian ports. Nothing moves in, nothing moves out. What you have now is what The Guardian correctly called a dual blockade. Two nations simultaneously strangling each other's access to the sea, while the rest of the world pays the price. The human cost of this is not abstract. The United Nations International Maritime Organization has reported that approximately 1,500 ships and their crews remain stranded in the Gulf, unable to move, trapped between two powers fighting for control of the water. 1,500 ships. Think about the crews on those vessels. Ordinary sailors, Filipino, Indian, Indonesian, Ukrainian, who had nothing to do with the decisions made in Washington and Tel Aviv, stranded, waiting, with no clear end in sight. American gas prices have hit $4.46 per gallon, the highest in nearly 4 years. Analysts at major banks are warning that prices could reach $5 per gallon if the strait remains closed. In parts of Asia that depend almost entirely on Gulf oil, fuel shortages have already begun. Rationing has been implemented in several countries. And in the United States, the families who were told this war would make America safer, make America great, make America strong, they are paying 52% more at the gas pump than they were before Operation Epic Fury began. I have said this in my writing, and I will say it again here. The people who make decisions about war never pay the price of those decisions. The price is always paid by others, by the sailors stranded in the Gulf, by the Iranian families who lost fathers and sons, by the American family filling up their tank on the way to work. This is not a political statement. This is a moral observation. And in my analysis, moral observations matter. Now let us examine exactly what happened on May 8th, because the details are revealing. U.S. Central Command's official account: Iran launched unprovoked attacks on 3 American Navy destroyers transiting the Strait of Hormuz. American forces responded with self-defense strikes against Iranian military facilities, specifically targeting sites on Qeshm Island and in Bandar Abbas, which serves as the naval headquarters of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Iran's official account: the United States fired first, targeting an Iranian oil tanker. Iran responded to defend its vessel. The American strikes on its coastal areas were a clear violation of the ceasefire. 2 completely contradictory accounts of the same events. Now, I am not going to tell you definitively who fired first. I was not there. The fog of war is real, and in situations like this, both sides have strong incentives to shape the narrative. What I will tell you is this: the question of who fired first is actually secondary to a more important observation. The ceasefire, which both sides had publicly committed to, produced a situation where, within 30 days, both sides were exchanging fire regularly enough that an incident of this scale was not a surprise to anyone watching closely. I wrote about this in early April. I said the ceasefire was fragile, not because either side necessarily wanted to break it, but because the underlying conditions that produced the war had not changed. The U.S. blockade of Iranian ports was still in place. Iran's control of the strait was still in place, and both sides were operating military assets in close proximity under rules of engagement that guaranteed eventual escalation. A fragile ceasefire in a high-tension environment is not peace. It is a pause before the next incident. And here's the most revealing moment of May 8th. Trump called Iranian missile strikes on 3 U.S. Navy destroyers a love tap. Then, in the same press availability, Trump said, if there's no ceasefire, you're not going to have to know. You're just going to have to look at one big glow coming out of Iran. Read those 2 statements together. Love tap, and then one big glow coming out of Iran. I have spent my career analyzing the communications of world leaders. I have studied Soviet leaders, Russian leaders, European leaders, American leaders, and I will tell you plainly, this is not strategic communication. This is not calibrated deterrence. This is not even coherent messaging. This is a leader who does not know what he wants to say, or who is saying different things to different audiences simultaneously, and whose words have therefore lost all meaningful content. When words lose their content, when the war is over, means nothing because missiles are flying 3 days later, you have a crisis of credibility. And a crisis of credibility is, in foreign policy terms, one of the most dangerous things that can happen, because your adversaries can no longer predict your behavior. And unpredictability in a nuclear-adjacent conflict is genuinely dangerous. Now I want to discuss the deal that Washington is currently pursuing, because it reveals something that I think historians will find remarkable. Axios reported, and this was confirmed by multiple sources, that American and Iranian negotiators are working on a 14-point-one-page memorandum of understanding. The American side is being led by Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff and his son-in-law Jared Kushner. The Iranian side includes several senior officials. Negotiations are happening both directly and through Pakistani and Omani intermediaries. What does this proposed agreement contain? The United States will lift sanctions on Iran. Billions of dollars in frozen Iranian assets will be released. Both countries will remove their respective blockades, the U.S. blockade of Iranian ports and Iran's restrictions on Hormuz. And then, after all of that, a 30-day period of detailed negotiations will begin to address the nuclear issue. I want you to understand the full significance of what I just described. Exactly this, is what Iran was demanding before the war started. Iran's position from day one was end the military hostilities first. Open Hormuz. Lift sanctions, release frozen assets, then negotiate the nuclear issue as a separate matter in a separate process with mutual respect for Iranian sovereignty. Washington's position from day one was the exact opposite. Iran must surrender its nuclear program first. Dismantle Natanz, Isfahan, and Fordo. Hand over highly enriched uranium to the IAEA. Permanently prohibit nuclear weapons development. Then, and only then, would Washington discuss sanctions and normalization. Rubio, in March, said Washington wanted unconditional surrender. Rubio in May is talking about a memorandum of understanding for future negotiations. Al Jazeera, which has covered this conflict more carefully than most Western outlets, ran a headline that captures the situation precisely. Has the U.S. accepted Iran's demand to settle Hormuz first, nuclear later? The answer, based on all available evidence, appears to be yes. Now let me be precise about what this means and what it does not mean. It does not mean Iran won the war in some simple sense. Iran has suffered enormous damage. Its military infrastructure was significantly degraded. Its supreme leader was killed. Its economy, already under severe sanctions, has been further devastated. The Iranian people have paid a terrible price. But it does mean this. Washington has arrived, after 2 months of war and enormous cost to all parties, at the diplomatic position that Iran was offering at the beginning. 2 months of bombing, thousands of dead, the global economy disrupted, 1,500 ships stranded, American gas at 52% above pre-war prices, and the endpoint, a one-page memo, sanctions lifted, Hormuz opened, nuclear talks to follow, is where Iran said it wanted to be in February. I have written about this pattern before. In different conflicts, in different decades. American administrations frequently go to war to achieve through force what could have been achieved through diplomacy. And frequently, not always, but frequently, they end up, after enormous bloodshed, at roughly the diplomatic position that existed before the war. I am not saying this with satisfaction. I am saying it with the sadness of someone who has watched this happen too many times. This is the part of the analysis that I consider most important. And it is the part that receives the least attention in Western media. When the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury on February 28th, the world watched to see how Russia and China would respond. Russia is Iran's strategic partner. Russia has sold Iran military equipment. Russia and Iran have cooperated on Syria, on energy, on countering Western sanctions. Russia had every reason to view the American attack on Iran as a direct threat to its own security interests, because if Washington can do this to Iran today, the logic extends to other countries tomorrow. China is Iran's largest trading partner. China has invested heavily in Iranian energy infrastructure. Iran's survival as an independent state is important to China's Belt and Road Initiative and to China's energy security. What did Russia do? Russia delivered strong speeches at the UN Security Council, condemned the strikes as aggression, called for an immediate ceasefire, and did nothing else. What did China do? China offered to mediate, used diplomatic back channels, helped broker the April ceasefire through quiet pressure on Tehran, and took no action that would carry any real cost for Washington. I wrote about this in early March, and I wrote about it again in late March. I said that the absence of meaningful Russian and Chinese support for Iran was sending exactly the wrong signal to Washington. Here is the signal it sent. You can do this. You can launch a war of choice against a sovereign nation, assassinate its leader, bomb its cities, blockade its waters, and the two powers that could most effectively constrain your behavior will do nothing beyond words. This is the most dangerous lesson of this entire conflict. Not what happened in Hormuz, but what did not happen in Moscow and Beijing. Because a world in which American military power faces no meaningful constraint is not a safer world, it is a more dangerous one. The logic of unconstrained power is escalation. If there are no red lines, there are no limits. I wrote in March, the brazen rampage that Trump has begun will just move on to another part of the world, and we will progressively move toward a confrontation that none of us will be able to control. I stand by that assessment today. Russia, in particular, needs to understand, and I say this as someone who has studied Russia for 50 years, that its strategy of hoping to avoid direct conflict with the United States by staying on the sidelines is not a strategy. It is a postponement. Every time Washington acts without consequence, the probability of the next larger action increases. The lesson of history is clear on this point. Appeasement, whether by Chamberlain in 1938 or by Moscow in 2026, does not prevent war. It makes war more likely, more destructive, and ultimately more costly for everyone. There is one more dimension I want to address, because it is important and it has been underreported. France deployed its nuclear-powered aircraft carrier to the Red Sea. President Macron called Iran's president directly. He then publicly called on both the United States and Iran to lift their respective blockades, without delay and without conditions. A NATO ally, publicly telling Washington to back down. I want you to understand how significant that is. France, a founding member of NATO, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, one of Washington's closest allies, publicly broke with American policy on this conflict. Italy's foreign minister, speaking to Rubio in Rome, said that Europe needs the United States and the United States needs Europe. Diplomatic language. But what it means is you are damaging the transatlantic relationship with this war. Saudi Arabia, whose oil depends on the Strait of Hormuz being open and who has the closest ties to Washington of any Arab state, publicly called for de-escalation and negotiations. The entire international community, with the exception of Israel, has been telling Washington the same thing for weeks. This is not working, the costs are too high, make a deal. And yet, on May 8th, while Rubio was in Rome on a fence-mending trip to repair damage to American-European relations caused by the very war he had just declared over, 3 U.S. destroyers were being fired on in the Strait of Hormuz. I have a phrase I use in my writing. I call it the Brussels view. From where I sit, not in Washington, not embedded in the American foreign policy establishment, not dependent on Pentagon contracts or State Department access, things look different. The world does not look the way Washington thinks it looks. American power is real, but it is not unlimited. American credibility is important, but it is not automatic. And American leadership requires more than the ability to bomb. It requires the wisdom to know when not to. That wisdom has been conspicuously absent in this conflict. Let me now give you my honest assessment of where this goes from here. I see 3 realistic scenarios. I will describe each one clearly. Scenario 1, a deal is reached. Iran accepts the 14-point Memorandum of Understanding. A 30-day negotiation period begins. The dual blockade is gradually lifted. Commercial shipping slowly resumes through Hormuz. Gas prices begin to fall. Trump declares a historic victory. The details of what this deal actually contains, whether it meaningfully constrains Iran's nuclear program or merely defers the issue, will determine whether this represents real resolution or simply another pause before the next crisis. Based on what I am reading in the negotiations, I believe this scenario is possible. But I also believe that the nuclear issue, deferred to a later negotiation, will resurface with all its difficulties intact. The fundamental tensions that produced this war have not been resolved. They have been paused. Scenario 2. Deadlock continues. Iran delays its response to the American proposal, or accepts parts of it while rejecting others. The negotiations drag on through May and into June. The dual blockade continues. A new incident occurs in Hormuz every week or two, small enough that neither side wants to escalate, large enough to keep the tension alive. The world economy continues to absorb the damage. American gas prices stay elevated. The 1,500 ships remain stranded, and the international community continues to watch, helpless, as 2 nuclear-adjacent powers play an increasingly dangerous game. This is, in my assessment, the most likely scenario in the near term. Scenario 3, escalation. A major incident, larger than May 8th, triggers a response that neither side can walk back. A U.S. warship is seriously damaged. American sailors are killed in significant numbers. Or Trump, facing political pressure at home from rising gas prices and a public that was told the war was over, decides to demonstrate resolve through a massive new strike on Iran. In this scenario, the one big glow coming out of Iran that Trump mentioned is not a metaphor. And the consequences for oil markets, for regional stability, for the broader geopolitical order would be severe and long-lasting. I do not think this is the most likely scenario in the immediate term, but I think it becomes more likely with every week that the deadlock continues and every incident that goes unresolved. I want to close with something that I think is the most important point of this entire video. Not a fact, not a figure, a question. Throughout my career, I have observed that the most dangerous failures of foreign policy are not failures of intelligence or failures of strategy. They are failures of moral reasoning. They are failures that occur when decision makers stop asking the most basic question, was this necessary? I have watched the Iran war unfold since February 28th. I have read the justifications. I have followed the military operations. I have tracked the negotiations. And I have tried, as I always try, to be fair to all sides. And I keep coming back to this. Thousands of people are dead. On the Iranian side, the death toll is enormous. In Lebanon, civilians have paid a terrible price. In the Gulf states, workers and ordinary people have been killed. And yes, American service members have been put in harm's way. The Strait of Hormuz, through which the world's economy breathes, has been closed for months. 1,500 ships are stranded. Gas prices are at historic highs. The global food supply chain is being disrupted because fertilizer moves through Hormuz. And after all of this, Washington is negotiating a deal that gives Iran essentially what Iran was offering before the war started. Was it necessary? That question is not being asked in Washington. It is not being asked in the American press. It is not being asked by the politicians who authorized and supported this war. And in my experience, when that question stops being asked, the next war becomes inevitable. I have said for years, and I will say it again today, that American foreign policy will not improve until the people who make it are held accountable for its results. Not just its intentions, not just its process, its actual results. The result of Operation Epic Fury, as of May 9, 2026, is this: thousands dead, Hormuz disrupted, the global economy damaged, American credibility strained, European allies distanced, Russia and China observing and recalibrating, Iran damaged but not defeated, the nuclear issue still unresolved, and 3 U.S. Navy destroyers being fired on in the Strait of Hormuz 72 hours after Rubio said the war was over. That is the result. And someone needs to be asking, loudly, persistently, and without apology, whether it was worth it. I am asking, and I hope, after watching this video, that you are asking too. Thank you for watching. I am Gilbert Doctorow. I publish analysis on my Substack, Armageddon newsletter, and I will continue to cover this crisis as it develops. If you found this analysis valuable, share it. The gap between what officials say and what is actually happening grows wider every day. The role of independent analysis that is not funded by governments, not dependent on official access, not shaped by institutional interests, has never been more important. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment. Tell me what you think the most likely outcome is. Deal? Deadlock? Escalation? I will see you in the next one.